Hello and welcome back to the Weismuller Homestead for day 8 of our sourdough starter. I am incredibly impressed by the activity on day 8 of the sourdough starters, and I will show you what I mean. So right here is our water sourdough starter, and if you remember yesterday I moved that rubber band. It has officially doubled in size. It rose like crazy overnight. Look at those bubbles. Look at that activity. That's amazing. That is exactly the kind of thing that you want out of a sourdough starter, especially this far along in the process. So I am going to mix it up. It smells sour. Oof. She is thick and those legs are doing it for me. If you know what I am talking about, then you just know. She is thick. She is beautiful. I do have some chunky pieces on the edge of the glass that I'm just gonna break off because I don't want those falling into the starter. So I'm just gonna mix it up here. When you mix it up, it should fall, which it is doing. So, and it should fall right back down to the spot where that rubber band was, which it did, which is perfect. So exciting. Okay, so go ahead, dump out half again. And I'm waiting for that to settle a little bit more. Okay, so I don't know if I've ever mentioned it before, but when you're feeding your sourdough starter, basically what it is you're adding the same ingredients that you added when you started the process, with the exception of what we did, which was change the ratios. So you're not, I mean, they call it feeding your sourdough starter. And I've had a lot of questions of like, what do you mean you're feeding it? Like, what are you feeding it? Why, what is that? What does that mean? So feeding it means you're literally feeding the bacteria that you are creating in your sourdough starter. And that's important because you're essentially growing yeast. You're growing bacteria to start that sourdough starter. So I always make a mess out of this. We have 2 cups of flour. Good. And a cup of water. I'm gonna add a little bit more because it wasn't quite a cup. Yeah. Let that settle for a second. And there we go. That's closer to a cup. Okay. And mix that up, and hopefully we see the same kind of activity tomorrow for day 9. Tomorrow is Thursday, and I have a Zoom meeting tomorrow at 6 for my daughter's volleyball team. But other than that, I don't have anything going on tomorrow night. So if this sourdough starter does the exact same thing, and she is super thick. If this water sourdough starter does the same thing and my milk sourdough starter performs the same way, I think I might forego day 10 and try to make a loaf tomorrow night. We will see. Ooh, much more difficult to stir up with how thick it is, which is great. That's the kind of consistency that we were looking for. Those few times that we were getting that watery consistency was not exactly the best. So I think changing the consistency, changing the ratio really helped. I'm gonna see what this ratio does tonight. If I have to add another half cup or cup of water tonight, I will do that. I just want to see what it does. But right now, it is thick, it's doughy, and I think that's a good consistency to go with. And just for visual's sake, Lily, can you rinse that for me, please? Yeah. Thank you. When I started this sourdough starter, you might remember me saying at one point that I really was hesitant about discarding so much sourdough starter. I didn't like the idea of doing that. So what I did was I saved some of the water sourdough starter in a mason jar, and off camera I've been doing the exact same thing, feeding it every day for 10 days. Look at all of the beautiful bubbles in here. And this rose, yesterday I discarded and I filled it up to about here. So I would say it's a little under halfway. It rose so much overnight that it popped the top. And if you can see the dome on top of this jar, that's how much it rose. And as I push that down, that is a hard sourdough starter stuck to the top of that paper towel on top. So I'm gonna have to change jars on this tonight. That's how active this water sourdough starter is, which is amazing, which is totally understandable with how many people or articles that I've read that say to use the water sourdough starter over the milk sourdough starter. Now, moving on to the milk starter. This is the milk starter. Again, the rubber band is where it was yesterday, so it did rise a bit. It nowhere near doubled in size. I will say it was approximately here earlier today, so it has risen and fallen, which is something else that you want to see in your sourdough starter. You do want to see it rise and fall. So it did rise, it did fall, but it maintained its shape, it maintained its bubbliness. If you can see those bubbles in there, and there's bubbles on top. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the exact same thing to this one. I'm gonna stir it up. It's got good legs. It's got good moisture. It's not too thick. It's not too runny. And I think I have once again flip-flopped in which one I think looks better. I think the water sourdough starter looks better than the milk starter today. But that's the whole point of this experiment, was everybody was saying that they're both good, and I wanted to see what the difference was. So I decided to go with both. If I was already gonna put in the effort of doing both, I may as well, or if I was already gonna put in the effort of doing one, I may as well put in the effort of doing both and find out for myself which one was better and what the difference in the dough would be. So that was the whole point of the experiment, and so far it is right on par with what I wanted it to be. So I've got about half of that mixture discarded. Scrape down the sides of my jar and go ahead and feed this. Now, doing the same thing, 1 cup of flour, 1/4 cup of sugar, and only feeding it 1/2 cup of milk in these last couple of days. I've got that in there, I'm gonna go ahead and mix it up. And you know, I've talked a couple of times about how to use these sourdough starters, you know, obviously sourdough bread, but there's lots of other options to use, especially because that water sourdough starter seems to like double in size and get really thick and big and voluptuous. And what can we do with all that sourdough starter? Well, I will tell you, after a couple of days, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put these in the fridge. What happens when you put them in the fridge is the yeast and the bacteria become dormant. So you do not have to feed them as frequently as you would if they were left out at room temperature, like they have been for the last 8 days. So you don't have to feed them as frequently. When you put them in the fridge, you might have to feed it like once a week, every other week. It might develop a nice layer of hooch on top. That's totally fine. And then when you're ready to bake another loaf of sourdough or do something with it, all you need to do is pull it out of the fridge, feed your sourdough starter. So it is important to remember what your ratio was and what you were feeding it previously. So feed your sourdough starter, leave it out at room temperature for another 24 hours, and then let it rise and fall, and the next day you should be able to use it. Now, when you use your sourdough starter and you make a loaf, you'll follow the recipe. Sometimes it's a cup, sometimes it's 2 cups of sourdough starter. And at that point, what you do is you feed it and you put it back in the fridge and you let it go. So, until you're ready to make another loaf of sourdough. The other options that you can do with this is you can make English muffins, you can make sourdough pancakes, sourdough waffles. There's all kinds of possibilities. If you just go on Pinterest and type in what can I do with my sourdough starter, what can I bake with my sourdough starter besides bread, it's gonna give you a lot of different options. So here we are, day 8, water starter, milk starter. Come back for day 9.